Well, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us to this discussion on getting to smarter solutions faster, how data is being leveraged to improve communities and economic competitiveness. My name is Rachel Riley, and we really just wanted to host this conversation today because we know as the collective, as we are all collectively pivoting to address some of the challenges that were brought about, but have probably been systemic for a while through the pandemic. We know that there are business leaders, community leaders, government leaders who are thinking really strategically about how to leverage data to better understand their current conditions, to tailor solutions that are responsive to those conditions, and to be able to also pivot when things aren't working. And it's really important, especially as we enter this environment where there's increased federal funding to fund some of these solutions that we're thinking inclusively, and we're able to scale up our efficiencies in the way that we're addressing these challenges. And not to use a phrase that I think we're all hearing a lot recently, but to how to build back better, very literally how to do better, be better as we use these resources to move forward. So what we're going to do here today is we are going to do presentations with our guest speakers from Heartland Forward, State of Place, and Digicity. We will take questions throughout. And before we kick it off, I want to turn it over to Andre Fuchs from StartCo, who will be helping to moderate and facilitate this conversation. So Andre, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Again, this is Andre Fuchs with StartCo. Rachel, thanks for convening this platform for us to have this great discussion today. For those of you who don't know, StartCo is a venture development group based in Memphis, Tennessee, that works with startups and partners and clients, all of which trying to launch technologies or innovative solutions or civic solutions to help build our communities going forward. And one such effort we've been working on over the past 3 years is an effort called the Digital City, where we're trying to marry smart city infrastructure with entrepreneurial ecosystem building. And this all kind of began with some discussions with the city of Memphis and the onboarding and partnering with the real estate development here in Memphis, a $1 billion mixed-use development where the idea is to turn their entire campus into a smart and connected community. So we thought it would be good to start having more discussion around data and how we use that data to kind of grow our environments going forward here. We service providers are always looking into data, but many times I feel like we limit ourselves in reporting mechanisms, always reporting back to funders and things of that nature, and not really getting into the true analysis of the data of what we could do going forward. And that's why I think this is a very important discussion today. We're always looking at how we broker technology, talent, and capital to grow our communities. And I think you'll find this very interesting, and the speakers that we have today really looking at data collection and built environments, understanding entrepreneurial ecosystem building and the data that sits behind that, and also looking at infrastructure that can collect data for better problem solving going forward. So we have great speakers. I'm going to have them introduce themselves real briefly. And as Rachel said, we'll spend 10 minutes with each of them, have a few question and answers along the way. But I would love to start with Dr. Mariela Alfonso. Would you mind giving a quick intro of who you are and what you're about?
Sure. Thanks, Andre, and thanks, Rachel. So yeah, my name is Mariela Alfonso. I'm the founder and CEO of State of Place. I'm also a research assistant professor at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering, and I have a PhD in urban planning focused on the relationship between urban design, behavior, and value. And I'll talk more about that later.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And Ross Duvall, would you mind walking us through your background and what you're involved in?
Sure, Andre. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm the president and CEO of Heartland Forward. Prior to establishing Heartland Forward, I was at the Milken Institute based in Los Angeles, California for 20 years, where I worked with Mike Milken in similar areas of entrepreneurship, access to capital, human capital, a whole range of activities in relating to health. So we're very pleased to be able to participate today.
Great, thanks, Ross. And Mike Beaver, would you mind doing the same?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Rachel, as well. And thank you all for spending some time with us. My name's Mike Beaver. I'm the expert in residence for IoT at DigiCity. I have a 20-year history in technology startups, particularly specializing in IoT and cybersecurity, as well as the infrastructure that goes towards building smart cities. So looking forward to being the nerd in the show today.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. And we'll come back to Mariela. Would love to kind of jump and dive right in. Would you mind describing how we can use data to better inform kind of our public decision-making and looking at the built environment? I know we've spent a lot of time together over the last couple of months, but could you share a little background on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Mike, I'm going to give you a run for the money on the nerd part of it, just from the data geek perspective. So, so first, to give you some context around my approach to data, which I think will help answer this question. As I mentioned, I have a PhD in urban planning focused on the relationship between the built environment and behavior, perceptions, feelings, and then how that translates into value across the economic, social, environmental, and health domains. And so over the past 2 decades, I've worked to quantify these ties between urban design and quality of life with the aim of using this data and evidence to advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable communities, as well as driving more effective and cost-efficient, inclusive city-making decisions. So city makers tend to have limited budgets and yet have a variety of goals they strive to achieve. So how do you begin to prioritize what, where, and whom to invest in? And at the same time, once you've made those decisions, how do you communicate the rationale behind them? And so for the most part, city makers have been making design, development, and policy decisions without access to the right data. Specifically data that helps them understand which investments to the built environment would have the most impact on quality of life outcomes and key performance indicators they care about. So instead, they're forced to rely on case studies and anecdotes or outside consultants, which may not always be the most effective or cost-efficient way to meet their goals. And then also these kinds of decisions often happen inside the building, and they end up only seeking public input when the decisions have been kind of fully baked. So when you don't have the data or evidence to defend the decisions and you haven't worked with and for communities, you're bound to get pushback, which then combined with city makers' lack of resources makes it really difficult to achieve city goals and more fundamentally make people's lives better. So these are the dual problems of decision-making and engagement, communication that we're addressing with State of Place. And the key to State of Place and what we do is that we've developed methods that allow us to, first of all, quantify the quality of urban design, that built environment, and then models that quantify how urban design translates into quality of life outcomes, meaning we can identify which built environment features, I'm talking about things like sidewalks, trees, benches, parks, so which of those kinds of features matter most to improving people's lives and can quantify, we can also quantify the actual benefits of improving urban design. So our software allows us to help city makers co-create these more just, thriving communities by tapping into data and predictive analytics that helps them identify these patterns of divestment that has led to inequitable quality of life outcomes, also prioritize built environment investments most likely to optimize those communities' health, social, economic, and environmental goals, and then quantify the return on investment of making those changes to not only maximize the impact of those limited resources, but also increase that transparency and accountability and build the trust and drive that consensus you need to actually get stuff done.
That's great. And I'm curious, you had mentioned like benches and sidewalks and things of that nature. Could you just kind of run through a few of the other data points that you're pointing to? I know we've talked in the past about connectivity and proximity, and maybe kind of segue that into, you know, a use case or something that people can hear where they can kind of cling on to in a particular community.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think a good way to think about the data that we collect is sort of like the nuts and bolts of places, what you feel going down the street, like why one street feels really great and then another street maybe you avoid. We're quantifying that. So these end up being things that we call micro scale aspects of urban design. So as I mentioned, things like street trees, benches, sidewalks, bike lanes, curb cuts, the setbacks of buildings, the number of vehicle lanes, all these things impact all sorts of choices and behaviors. So we collect this data using something called visual machine learning. That's where the geeky part comes in. So we've trained all these different computer vision models to be able to say, oh, this blob over here, this is a street light, this thing over here is a fence. And that allows us to collect this super fine and granular detailed data at the street block for an entire city, right? So to get at like, well, what do we do with this data and why does it matter? I think one of the use cases that I'm most proud of most recently is my work with the city of Philadelphia. We began working with them last year in the midst of COVID and the height of the Black Lives Matter protest. And they understood that there was a link between this racist divestment patterns in the built environment, all the features that I'm just talking about, but that they tied into inequitable disparities of quality of life among vulnerable communities that COVID just kind of highlighted and exacerbated. But what they needed was a way to quantify this, and then, but most importantly, identify the most impactful investments that they could make to improve the lives of these structurally harmed communities. So what we did was we collected this data that I mentioned using visual machine learning and other machine learning techniques. And then we aggregate that into a score called the State of Place Index, which is just a score from 0 to 100 that ultimately measures kind of how walkable, bikeable, or livable a place is. And then we break this down into 10 areas of urban design. So these are things like form, density, connectivity, physical connectivity, not so much digital connectivity, bike and pedestrian amenities, traffic safety, personal safety. And these are all things that we know from the evidence actually impacts our behaviors, feelings, perceptions. And so what we're able to do then is visualize this data, both for like a heat map, spatially perspective, but also graphically. And this allows the city to then actually begin to have an understanding of assets and needs and where there's divestment patterns that tie back to spatial inequity and begin to have those conversations with the community, which is what the aim of the city is. But then, we have these forecasting models I mentioned earlier that we tie urban design to all of these outcomes. Well, what that allows us to do is, okay, well, we know that some urban design features actually matter more if you want to reduce diabetes. Some things matter more for mitigating floods. So what this allows our city makers to do is to use the software and say, these are the things that are most important for the community, and therefore get a recommendation of which are the specific urban design features that I mentioned earlier that are going to have the most impact on those set of community goals. And then the goal there is next steps for Philadelphia is to use the scenario tool that we've built into the software. It's a little bit like a SimCity tool where they can work with the community and say, let's make these changes. Let's see what happens if we were to do this and test it in real time. But then also say like, okay, so we increased our State of Place Index by 25 points. What does that mean in terms of things like retail revenues or asthma or heat waves, vehicle collisions and crime? And with the case of Philadelphia, I've given a whole bunch of other presentations, so I won't get into the nitty gritty today, but we found to high level to give you a sense of the impact of this, things like 5 points in the State of Place Index impacted, 1 fewer COVID death. 10 points was, 5 fewer folks hospitalized with COVID. 20 points was tied to 0.5% reduction in transmissions. And even from a homicide perspective, places that were below average state of place had 8.7 times more homicides. So it really has huge bottom line impacts on people's everyday lives. And of course, the other thing that we found was that all of these things were disproportionately worse in structurally harmed communities.
Yeah, I see a question popping up here. Let me see if we can address it. It says, would you describe and talk more about what spatial equity involves and what factors are associated with the demographics and social classes also with that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with respect to spatial equity, what we're trying to say is that investments in the built environment have not been equitable. And because of that, you see all sorts of impacts across different quality of life. So disproportionately negative outcomes in that regard. And so by investing in the built environment, you can facilitate that improvement in quality of life. So that's overall what we mean by spatial equity. And like, for example, in the case of Philadelphia, what we found were, places that had a lower state of place index, so poor urban design, had higher concentrations of Black residents, lower income households, lower education levels, higher household sizes, less access to vehicles, and were more likely to work from home. So some of these things are the things you would normally think about, but some of these things were particularly important with respect to COVID.
And I'd love to bring a couple the other panelists into the discussion. Ross, I think a little bit about some of the discussions that we've had and thinking through the state of place and understanding the built environment better and how that could be a bolster to talent and entrepreneurial activity. I'm just curious what thoughts you might have in terms of what she's been talking about in her technology.
Well, first, let me introduce my nerd cred, which is that I was 20 years at the Milken Institute as chief research officer. And prior to that, I worked for Larry Klein at the University of Pennsylvania, Nobel Prize winner in econometric forecasting. So I got some nerdy street cred there as well. This relates directly into some of the work we're doing investigating entrepreneurial ecosystems and what leads to their formation and expansion, especially density. We're doing this first at the state level, but next we're going to go to the metropolitan level. And what we found is kind of a proxy for quality of place at the state level is the number of miles of coastline and how many mountains you have in the top 200 close by to you within 50 to 100 miles. It really gets at what we were discussing around the state of place, because I think especially coming out of COVID, we have remote workers, remote entrepreneurs that are footloose today and can go virtually anywhere. So I think that the state of place is an important metric for thinking about building entrepreneurial ecosystems and how you might be able to attract that talent.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Mike, I'm curious what you think about state of place in terms of from the technology perspective and all the applicabilities that you may see its use for.
Oh, it's enormous. I've been incredibly lucky to work with Dr. Alfonso over the last few months as well. And the thing for me was the what if analyzer. So it's a two-way street, and I thoroughly intend that pun as well when building cities. It is a two-way street. The technology that we create and the technology that we deploy can both feed into state of place and be influenced by state of place. So one of the things that we're working on particularly in Memphis, and I'm sure this will resonate no matter where you are in the country, of where you are in the world, in fact, is looking at the quality of the road surface. Now, it's a key indicator because we all hate driving down roads and hitting potholes and things like that. So we're actually working with a technology called Good Roads to scan the road surface and look for defects in the road surface, then map that into the state of place environment. Because again, it's an equity. How often does the city repair the roads? How often does, in the UK, Highways Agency repair the roads? Now, gut feeling would say, well, in the less serviced and less equitable neighborhoods, those roads don't get serviced as often, which leads to greater vehicle damage. And greater vehicle damage in the end of, at the end of the day, for a poorer or less lower income neighborhood is a much more heavy financial burden and an unexpected burden potentially on that area that can least afford it. So that's kind of one direction we can feed into state of place. What I'm lucky enough to take out of state of place, apart from the what if analyzer, is the ability to then use and design and assign technology to those outcomes. So if Dr. Alfonso and her team say, right, okay, on this particular part of the city, digital equity is terrible. There's terrible cell coverage, terrible wireless coverage. It's a low-income neighborhood. Is there something you can do? And the opportunity is yes, absolutely. There are government grants, federal grants, in order to improve that digital equity. Now, when working with a public entity, the laser focus right now is on value for money, is responsible spending. Now, being able to quantify the qualitative, i.e. assign a state of place index score to a particular neighborhood, run it through the what if analyzer, and then come out at the other end and say, if you invest this money in this neighborhood, doing this project with this technology, it will cost you X, but it will improve your state of place score by Y. Now, all of a sudden, it's not anecdotal, it's evidence backed. If I'm going to a responsible spending panel, I automatically have the evidence that I can put on the screen that says, by using technology and investing this money, this is the outcome I get. And that was previously something that was very, very difficult to do. So I can feed into state of place, I can take out a state of place. It's absolutely superb in that way.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Andre.
Go ahead.
Just on that point, as folks are talking to their local government about potential outlays or investments that they want local government to be making, how should we be thinking about the long-term cost savings for the private sector or long-term revenue generation opportunities through tax base for that sector, so that we're actually like tying a dollar sign to a dollar sign? Is there any way to measure or think about that or make projections?
Are you asking me?
I think everyone, yeah. Given,
I mean, that's in turn like what we're doing, with state of place, that forecasting mechanism. So in addition to what Mike mentioned regarding, okay, this is going to be your increase on the state of place index, we then say, well, what does that actually mean from an economic value perspective, from a social value perspective? So like the example that I gave you with COVID, like you can see this percentage drop, which we know has associated costs with it. Or in the case of like retail revenues, we can see specifically, okay, in the next 10 years, these are the increase in revenues based on the amount of square footage. We can calculate what the value capture is going to be based on the investment, and then divide that by the cost of the project to get your return on investment. And that's what part of what the software does. So that was part of what we were trying to do, is give city makers that sort of rationale, that justification for why place matters.
Okay, so I think we'll segue here into Ross Duvall. Ross, really curious and would love to learn a little bit more about how you're using data with some of the efforts you're working on at Heartland Forward.
Well, thanks, Andre. I appreciate that kind introduction. We just launched Heartland Forward in October of 2019. Sometimes that seems like 3 days ago, other times it seems like 3 years ago in COVID. Heartland Forward is really a think and do tank focused on trying to improve economic performance in the center of the country. It's a large heartland. There's 20 states, from Michigan in the Northeast, south to Alabama, west to Texas, and north to North Dakota. So Tennessee's right there in the middle of our heartland. And we really believe that at the core of America is the heartland. The region faces serious challenges, but also home to some of the fastest growing cities. Is businesses and universities and talented people can spark long-term growth. So our mission is to unleash that potential and really look at fact-based solutions, principally in 3 areas: one around job creation, knowledge-based and inclusive growth, and improved health outcomes, because they're all interrelated. There are 4 pillars of our research and programs. One is innovation and entrepreneurship. We explain why that's so critical for regional economic prosperity. And we try to provide policymakers with the understanding of the policy and structural tools that are available to boost entrepreneurial activity. Also focused on building human capital. Once again, same focus there around workforce educational attainment, and to ensure that workforce skills match employer needs. We focus on regional competitiveness as our third pillar. So think of more traditional factors like tax rates, infrastructure build out that we're talking about today. And then lastly is health and well-being. You want to talk about the state of place. Well, if you don't have the right built out environment, it results in poor socioeconomic determinants of health, which leads to higher obesity and much higher healthcare costs and lower formation of human capital. Let me give you an example of how we try to translate what we do into actions on the ground. We have introduced what we call our Community Growth Program and Toolkit. It's really the inaugural program of Heartland Forward. And we do this through a shared investment with communities to kind of build and equip social entrepreneurs, and in some cases, scalable business entrepreneurs or community builders who have a vision for addressing systemic change. And so we work very closely with Donna Harris at Builders and Backers in designing and implementing that program. We've piloted it in Tulsa and Oxford. We have it's Oxford, Mississippi, and we have two great cohorts that are about to be our first graduates. Another kind of campaign, I'll call it, we have underway is Connecting the Heartland. Talk about state of place and the importance of broadband. It's really a multi-pronged, multi-state advocacy campaign in the Heartland to boost internet availability, internet speeds, adoption rates, and participation in online services. And we are working with partners, principally currently in Tennessee. We had the mayor of Memphis on a session yesterday, Arkansas, Illinois, and Ohio. So that's kind of our broad mission and the ways that we engage.
Well, thanks for that good overview, and I'm gonna jump right in and really curious about some of the research and analysis you've been doing around talent. We were just talking a little bit about this, but some of these characteristics of successful places and how you're looking at the changing dynamics of talent and entrepreneurship, innovation, et cetera. And I'd love for you to just shed a little light on some of that.
Well, I promise to keep it as less nerdy as possible, but we've performed what I consider to be some important research on the role that young firms play in driving job and economic growth across communities. And young firms are defined as new business entities that are 5 years old or less, as distinct from young establishments such as a new Burger King, which is a new location for an existing firm. But following moderate stability during the 1990s, the US saw a noticeable decrease in the share of private sector employment at young firms that's lasted nearly 15 years. And today there's approximately 1/3 fewer workers that hold jobs at young firms than in 2000. So think about that. And it's really the rapid growth of a relatively small number of young firms, mostly knowledge intensive or maybe tech focused, that are responsible for that long-term enduring growth. And so that's why we think it's so critical to build entrepreneurial capacity and really look at the aspirations of the founders. So let me get a little bit nerdy, but I'll keep it as simple as possible. So if a metro had average employment growth, we would expect a 1 standard deviation increase in the young firm's share of employment, kind of what we call Main Street entrepreneurship, to result in a 15% faster growth rate. Now that doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot. Then if you move to knowledge intensity, which we measured as the percent of employees at young firms 5 years of age or less that have a bachelor's degree or above. So the standard deviation among metros is about 5 percentage points. So if you could improve your score by 5 percentage points, you would expect 34% in faster job growth. So that's really, really important in our opinion. But also it's kind of troubling around our findings in the Heartland. We lag in young firm formation and kind of entrepreneurial vitality. The Heartland only has 5 of the top 50 metros overall in the index and 30 of the bottom 50. Now, the good news for Tennessee is that Nashville ranks 12th in the nation, tops in the Heartland, but other Tennessee metros didn't score as high. Memphis is ranked 299th out of 382 metros. And I would say there's multiple causes for subpar rate job creation rates in the Heartland, but there's no single factor that's more important than entrepreneurial capacity and having the talent base to really support those entrepreneurs. So when you look at those environments, and I mentioned we're going to be releasing a new report that looks at some of the underlying factors behind that. And one of those, you can explain a great deal of the variation in almost anything by looking at the percent of the adult population with a bachelor's degree or above. And it's no different in kind of assessing entrepreneurial capacity building. We found that to be the single most important factor by itself. There's a lot of underlying determinants as well, but the single best measure of kind of educational attainment, that is critical, and also obviously access to early stage risk capital and the quality of place, regardless of how you want to measure it, absolutely critical for entrepreneurship. Thanks, Andre.
And just a quick follow-up, this is obviously an area that we've been working in as well for a number of years. And we've always felt, well, the data is very clear when you look at some of these analyses, and many times it's tough to get communities to embrace, these types of forms of economic development, considering the old traditional forms of economic development. I think there's more of a hybrid model that we all need to embrace going forward. Any insights in terms of successes you've seen in communities that were slow to react and helping them to move further along on this pathway that you're talking about?
Well, what you're talking about, Andre, is what I refer to as a balanced portfolio approach to economic development and transitioning away from enticing or bribing companies to expand or relocate operations. Look, you can understand why economic developers are still somewhat wedded to that, because politicians love to stand up and say, we help bring 250 jobs here from somewhere else because it's a big news headline. So, I mean, when you look around the country, there are very few places that have been more successful than Nashville. You have that great quality of place. You wet it with kind of research and Vanderbilt, the healthcare platform that's there, the historic understanding of entrepreneurship. You look at places like Austin, but there are new places in the Heartland that are moving up. You think of a place like Ann Arbor, think of leading research universities that commercialize. Think about Madison, Wisconsin, once again, research universities focusing on entrepreneurship and trying to build that. So I think there's many success stories around the Heartland in terms of building entrepreneurship and talent, but there's still this hesitancy among accredited investors to invest in early stage companies. That's where one of our biggest challenges lies. It's partly one of education of investors.
And I wanted to bring Mariela and Mike into the conversation. I'm curious you all's thoughts in terms of whether it's thinking through state of place or thinking through infrastructure and technology, but elements within there that are conducive to entrepreneurial building, whether it's the knowledge-based jobs that Ross was talking about, or even Main Street businesses that are out there. I'm just curious, both of your thoughts. Maybe Mike, we start with you, and then Mariela, we could follow up.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts that I have on this, one of which is very close to my heart, and I'll come on to that one second. But you're absolutely right. All of this can be driven by data, and that's kind of one of the key things here. And getting that investment is difficult. We were actually talking before the webinar started about the majority of money in investment, certainly that I come across, is in tech. And the amount of money being thrown at tech is ludicrous nowadays. All you need to do is go and do a very simple wire search, and you can see the seed rounds, the A rounds, the B rounds that all these companies are being invested in. They're getting billion-dollar valuations at the drop of a hat, and very few of them turn into that. But tech has always been seen to be one of those industries that we'll take a risk on, because if it comes off, the payday is enormous. Now, the wonderful thing is, and moving on to my second point, is tech, real disruption in tech tends to come from younger generations. There is a natural tech savviness that comes out, and there's probably not a week that goes by that we don't hear of some 16 and 17-year-old who's invented the next social media platform, or has cured or found a way to scoop up ocean plastics using twigs and bits of string, something along those lines. What really helps for me, and in the context of what we're talking about, is the data that's collected in the community can also be used to drive entrepreneurship and can be driven through social enterprise. Now, one of the things close to my heart is taking underserved and privileged communities and driving data analysis courses and education through those communities where they wouldn't previously have a chance. Now, the wonderful thing in a smart city, especially using tech from all of these different IoT sensors that we have, is that we generate just about any piece of data you could think of. Now, you put that data set in front of someone young who experiences those problems every single day. They know what they want to do to solve it. They know what the problem is because they live it every day. You are not going to get a better opportunity to fix your community, and you guarantee if it's in one community, it's in more. And you've got absolute resource to a talent pool that you previously would never have tapped, because they may not be able to afford to go to university. They may not have an opportunity to go into this world. So that is absolutely where the community comes together, entrepreneurship comes together, and those funds would absolutely, it would be a far safer investment to invest in a community than it would to take a punt on an opportunity from some tech grad, because you've got this community and you've got this thing that you know you can solve. So tech plays a huge part in that. It drives innovation, it drives disruption, but using social enterprise and using community to do that is a huge opportunity that I think we're all missing.
Thanks, Mike. And Mariela, what are your thoughts here and some of the context that Ross was providing, and then also Mike here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ample evidence at this point that the quality of place is a huge driver in terms of economic development, even though, place-based economic development strategies are still slower to uptick, but it's quite clear, especially now after the pandemic, as you've mentioned, Ross, like kind of, there's more flexibility and freedom in terms of where people can go and work. It's not tied to a specific place, so that way they have more choice in that place. And then that means that the actual place matters that much more. But I think another way that we need to think about this is, what about the places, that we've been discussing, these, historically structurally harmed places that have been underserved. What about, I would say we need to really focus on enhancing the place quality of those places, not so much because we want to attract outside folks, but rather because we want to make sure that the folks in those communities have sort of the foundational pieces needed from a place perspective, so that the place isn't making them vulnerable. And then that's what's really needed to allow them to thrive, in addition to, of course, all the other aspects that you were mentioning, Mike. But I think that, that's the way I see this, is we need to make sure that place doesn't harm, that it helps people thrive.
Great. Thank you for that. And we're going to keep things moving here. Mike, I was hoping that you could maybe provide just a little bit of background on kind of better visualizing data and the infrastructure needed to do that in communities. You're seeing more and more communities try to move to becoming a smart community, but a lot of folks have varying definitions of what that means. And so I was hoping maybe you could give first a backdrop of that, and then really getting actually into what you just mentioned a little bit earlier, into being able to visibly see what's happening in those communities.
Absolutely. So it's been wonderful conversation so far, and at the heart of all of it is tech. And for any city makers on the line on the webinar, building a smart city is very much like building your normal city. In a normal city, you generally, going back to the Middle Ages, over in the UK, we have history that goes back that far. Going back to the Middle Ages, you generally choose your settlement location because it's defensible, there's food and water sources nearby, and there are the things you need. There might be ore if you're near the mountains, there might be wood if you're near a forest, etc. And then once you've built the foundation of your city, you then start to build your buildings, and those buildings have functions. So a hospital doesn't have the same function as a shopping mall, for example, and things like that. And you build your functions that way. And then the most important part of your city is the people. So all of that comes together and it forms your city, and it gives your city an identity. And America is incredibly strong in this way. You can throw out the name of a city and everyone will instantly have an idea of what the people from that city are like and what that city's like. So that's the exciting bit. That's the normal world. The smart world is zero difference. You build a foundation of technology. And this is where I'm very lucky. I get to work with folks like Dr. Alfonso, because state of place, in my mind, is a foundational technology that every single city should use, because you're quantifying the qualitative. So it's a very strong mechanism there. In the same way, once I've done this and I've built my city, I then need to start thinking about connectivity in my city. I need to be able to move the data around my city, because I'm going to go and deploy all these different sensors, which are, in essence, my buildings. They have different functions. It might be video cameras, might be air quality sensors. It might be traffic counting sensors. There are some piezoelectric ones that you can use. There are all sorts of sensors. Anything you can think of is a sensor. Oddly enough, my fridge and my freezer at home are both IoT devices, which is very strange. But I build my sensors. I've got to move that data around in the same way that I've got to be able to navigate and move around a physical city. So I do that. I put wireless in, I put 5G in. If you're not already a 5G city, please go and become a 5G city, because we're creating volumes of data from these sensors that we need to move around. And then finally, add the people. And again, the people are the most important piece, whether that's the data analysis side, whether that's the community side. It doesn't really matter, because the people that you use to solve the problems that your city has, which influences the IoT sensors that you put in, are what are genuinely going to make a difference. Now, where all of that leads to is this idea of community-led data. Now, I'm very lucky. I work with a lady called Chelsea Collier. I spend an awful lot of time working with her. She's one of the brightest and smartest people in the entire smart city industry. And between her and some of her colleagues and friends in the fellowship at Manchester University, also through smaller influences that I have, there is a community and a consortium-led approach to data. Okay, so it's this idea of we create a trust in which the data is held. There's a number of reasons for that. So the primary reason for that is that people don't understand what the data is being used for, what data is being collected, and what personal information, if any, is being collected about them. With all of those things in mind, you generate public mistrust. As soon as you start generating public mistrust, your projects aren't going to work. You can put video cameras up everywhere and everyone instantly assumes that you're looking out for bad people doing bad things. Now, that might be part of it. But what you might also be using those cameras for is to count the number of vehicles going through a particular intersection to figure out the best pedestrian safety mechanisms to put on that intersection. But that's not what we think about first up. The second thing is that a picture tells 1,000 words. And if I'm being videoed, then people have access to my image and they think that that's going to be used in some way to social engineer them. It's not. And by the way, the government already has your image if you have a driving license or a passport. So combining all of these things, but by putting them in a data trust and making that trust a community-driven data trust, enhances or lessens the community mistrust of what that data can be used for. What you can then do is use that consortium to drive a series of task forces to ideate and then use the foundational technology to solve the problems in those communities. And that's what we're lucky enough to do in Memphis. So we generate task forces for particular sets of problems, and we have different public bodies, private bodies, individuals contributing into those task forces. And they ideate together to solve a problem, which we then apply technology to. And we use state of place to, as I said before, to score that problem. If we solve it using technology like this, it will cost this much. It will give you this benefit, and it will improve the state of place index by this value. And that's the way that we then go back to those federal fund holders, to those private investors, to the philanthropic charities and individuals that Rachel does such a fantastic job with as well at Aces and Archers. So by doing all of that and bringing that community trust and this community data model together, you get much greater buy-in from everybody. Now, the final thing I will say, and I'm appreciative that I've not done it throughout the entirety of my presentation, but when you are working in the public, use simple English. That way they're not scared, they're not confused by technology jargon, they're not confused by big words and geeking out and things that they hear maybe in the industry. And have them understand, have them able to see and visualize the data that's being collected on them. It's something we built into our consortium model here, is that any member of the public in any consortium-led city can request access to see what we're working on, and we're open with that. You get that community buy-in, and that's the role that technology can truly play. It's not the great evil, it's the great enabler, and that's where we're really building, and that's where I think that we can go in the future.
Mike, as a follow-up, where are you seeing even small examples of this happening, and not just confined to the US, anywhere of where this infrastructure is being put in place to solve a community problem?
Yeah, so numerous examples from my background. But one of the big problems we have in Europe is we have a lot of railways, and those railways are fairly old, and there was not much planning and not many wide open spaces to run them in. So what we would get is we would get a lot of what they call kind of pedestrian infrastructure interaction. So people on the tracks, or animals or vehicles, those kind of things. In the UK in particular, we have a number of unmanned level crossings. So where a road crosses a railway, but there's no barriers or anything along those lines. And we use video and we use mobile device technology to create proximity warnings. So if we know that there's a train in the area and there is a vehicle within, or there is an object within a certain proximity, we can actually send alerts and make sure either the signals are changed or that there's a warning put out to the driver so that they can begin to slow down. So that's kind of a more rural aspect rather than in the towns. We also have a lot of work I do in airports, which is a massive part of a community. I would imagine there's massive research about the benefits that an airport brings to a particular city in commerce and entrepreneurship and in industrial benefit. It's things like making sure that the traffic routes out of that airport are the most effective things in the world. So it's the most effective way. Looking at downtown areas, we do a lot of work, again, with mobile device technology and again, digital connectivity. So it's this idea of, if you're working, say, with one of the downtown commissions, you can have an interactive, so if you provide a public Wi-Fi service, you can have an interaction now with visitors coming to the city. They come, they sign up to the Wi-Fi service, and when they're in a proximity of a particular park or a store or a location within the city, a point of interest, you can have some information sent directly to their device. And they can either, it might be a coupon for a local restaurant if you're working on improving local business. It might be an advert that says, hey, look, in this park, over the next couple of days, there's this festival or a food festival or a farmer's market, something along those lines that generates that visitor revenue. When you're working with mass transit, it can be things along the lines of contactless or digital payment systems that are all Wi-Fi connected, but then also feeding the data back about where people get on and off trains and trams and trolleys and buses to the transit authorities, so that they can schedule better, they can put better services on. It could be working with a stadium to say, okay, on game day, pedestrians flow in a certain direction, they tend to take the same routes. Now, what we might start doing there is layering in contextual information like the weather. If it's raining, then people typically tend to go in one direction. If it's nice and sunny, they tend to go in another direction. We can look at where they stop, where they congregate. Is there a bar area that we need to improve flow through? Is the parking near the stadium, or is it further out in different parts of town? We can relay that information to the local police force so that when they're doing their crowd control and crowd management, they can have a much better and much more efficient response. I could sit here all night and give you examples until we're all tired of hearing me. So on that note, because I think we are starting to get tired of hearing me, I will stop and I will hand back.
Well, no, this is great, Mike. And I want to get a couple of comments from Ross and Mariela. Ross, I'm curious, communities that are trying to advance themselves to the functions that Mike is speaking about, to become smarter, to become more advanced, in terms of, entrepreneurial activity, talent, whether it's retaining the talent, attracting talent, fostering it. What are your thoughts in terms of regional competitiveness, how this infrastructure can play a role?
Well, thanks, Andre. I would say if there's anything good that comes out of COVID-19, it could be the greater recognition of how important high-speed internet access is, not only in terms of the workforce, but in terms of entrepreneurship. And, in my mind, it really advanced kind of the movement towards remote interactions 10 years. But, we talk a lot about kind of rural disconnectedness and not enough about some of the challenges in urban areas. So I think that it's really critical, and we're starting to see this out of the federal funding, to really boost high-speed internet funding for availability and adoption. Because in many places where you have availability, you don't have the high adoption rates. And that partly goes towards kind of subsidizing it. We know as economists, if you subsidize or incentivize something, you'll get more of it. You can debate whether it's efficient or not, but that will be a result. And I would say that boosting high-speed internet access in many urban communities really helps current residents tap into the entrepreneurial economy as well as tapping into the workforce. So I see that as just a fundamental kind of state of place investment that we're making progress on that we should have done 10 years ago.
I totally agree. And Mariela, I'm not sure how much time you've spent thinking through what Mike was just kind of outlining in terms of how it fits with some of the work that you're doing. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interplay between sort of the centers that you were talking about, Mike, that provide some of this data, it could be very, very useful for some of the forecasting models that we create with State of Place. But I also wanted to touch briefly upon what you mentioned around language, because I think that there is an opportunity to, not just speak in a very, lay, open, friendly way, but also use the technology to build capacity. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with State of Place by kind of having city makers use the tool with the community. Now the community learns the language of urban design. They understand the links between the built environment and the things that impact their lives. They're usually good about sort of saying, oh yeah, we don't like this, there's this rundown building here, there's no lighting, or they're like, oh, there's no jobs, or, there's other things from a quality of life perspective. But, being able to have them understand and internalize how these two things are connected, just builds so much more capacity and makes them, I guess, smarter, in any sense of the word, stakeholders, but also then allows us as city makers to extract their expertise about their community in a more streamlined way.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and just want to say thank you to everyone here, especially our speakers, Dr. Mariela Alfonso, Ross Duvall, and Mike Beaver. We really appreciate you all taking some time today and sharing your insights with our group. With that being said, Rachel, is there anything that you want to add in here at the end?
Yeah, thanks, Andre. There are 2 more questions that I think we probably have time for. So the first question is from Dr. Lee. And the question is, how can universities and colleges continue to create and develop curricula to nurture and support personnel who understand urban planning, technology, data collection, and creative placemaking, the arts? So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. I have a resource I'll drop in the chat after folks answer, but.
As a non-academic, I certainly don't have a PhD, if you heard me talk. As a non-academic, for me, it's don't be in an ivory tower. That's kind of the big thing for me, is go out, get involved in a community, go and sort of sit down with the people on the ground and try and apply research there. I get tons of computer science grads coming out who can all program beautifully. They can write elegant code. They can solve programming problems that have existed for 30 years and all of these wonderful things. But there's not nearly as much, certainly in IoT and developing that way, there is not nearly as much in terms of real life problem solving. So that's a wonderful way that you could do that. Engage with either local public bodies or entrepreneurship funds again, or even those social enterprises that are existing in every single city out there. That's, for me, the really cool way that universities can get involved and start to educate there. And you don't have to be academic to come and speak. I'm lucky enough, I actually go and speak to a couple of universities in the UK on IoT for marketing people. So for technology marketing. So I go and talk to marketing people about how to talk technology in a way that people can understand. So don't be afraid to link it in that way as well.
Yeah, and I dropped a link to a new resource that just came out yesterday called the Apex Project. It's a project that is helping provide higher ed with a guide to inclusive economic development. And it was developed by a really great community organization called Opportunity Alabama. So check that out. I believe it was also funded by the Lumina Foundation. And Andre, with just 1 minute left, there's a request for folks to share, or panelists to share, the best way to get a hold of them, whether it's their website or email address.
Are you asking me? I'm happy to share mine, or
I think everyone. Yes.
Sure.
Yes. Go first, please.
Yeah, I mean, mine is Andre at neverstop.co, or you could go to neverstop.co.
I just typed mine into the chat box. That's my email address, and you can go to our website, heartlandforward.org, as well.
And mine is Mariela at stateofplace.co. And you can also go to stateofplace.co. It's our website. I'll type it in as well.
And Mike dropped his in there as well. So
yep. And you can find me on Twitter at Mike Beaver, LinkedIn, just by my name. It's quite an unusual surname. Or you can email me at mike.beaver@anarian.co.uk.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Andre, I'm actually going to kick it over to you for any last thoughts. We're right there at the, not top of the hour, but.
Yeah,
Right.
We'll just say thanks everyone for participating, and we'll keep in touch with the next one of these convenings that we're going to do. But we really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.